Dropping in water is my all-time favorite watercolor technique, and it is so easy. Today I am showing you 3 stunning watery watercolor techniques. We're going to start right away with my favorite technique of dropping in water. This is what it can look like. You can see on Lucius's ears where we dropped in water because it is pushing the pigment away in these kind of beautiful cauliflowery blooming patterns. We're leaning into that when we drop in water. The second technique is water resist, which is very similar to dropping in water, but it's usually done in a more controlled way to create details like lines and dots. You can see here on Ziggy that we are using water resist in a line shape to help distinguish his fur. Our last demo will be color resist, which is basically the same thing as water resist, but we're using color. Here you can see that we have color resist in Gwith's muzzle with cobalt teal and on his fur with some opera pink. Moving over to Hans the bunny, we are using color resist by dropping in quinacridone gold on that area of his ear that has some neutral tint in the background. And finally, you can see color resist in action on Lakota's nose with the dots of cobalt teal on his nose. Color resist is really cool because even if you're putting a lighter color over the top of a darker color, because of the wetness and the way that watercolor works, it still can push the underlying color out away from it. But color resist is kind of an advanced technique. And by advanced, I mean just knowing and being able to anticipate and having that practice of understanding kind of how your colors are going to work as you paint with them will help you a lot. So if you are a true beginner, you can absolutely try color resist, but don't get too frustrated. It will likely take you some time and understanding which colors do it better because some colors push other colors away a lot better than other colors. As always, you can find all the supplies I'm using in today's video in your supply list at paint333.com. Okay, so I have my ear shape painted with water, and I'm going to drop in some color, and then I'll show you how cool it can be to drop in water and how great it looks once the water has a chance to manipulate the pigments and how it looks once it's dry. So I add a little bit of neutral tint to the outside. I'm going to go ahead and add a purple color. So I'll start with some ultramarine. And then I'll drop in some opera pink. And then I'll finish with a little quinacridone next to the pink. I don't want to put this next to the blue because I'm not too excited to get a green color. So as you can see, just letting those colors mix on the page is already producing a beautiful ear shape. You can go in with your grainer brush and pull that color to create textured edges. But dropping in water is as simple as that. You literally load your brush with water and drop it in. And it will push the pigments out from wherever you ended up dropping it in. And you can help guide it if you need to, or you could just let it do its thing. We have a lot of green over here, so I'm just going to drop in a little bit more pink. I'm going to show you this again with an ear that's mostly black. We have our neutral tint. We're adding to a wet area in the shape of an ear. Coming in with a heavy mix of neutral tint. And then we're going to drop in water and let that water push the neutral tint around. I'm lifting a little bit of that extra water out so it has a little bit more room to move. So lifting that extra pigment out, dropping in some new fresh water, and letting it swirl and move around. However, that looks great. So these two examples, the paper was super, super wet. But oftentimes we can get a lot of magic happening when we let the paper and the paint get a little bit more dry. So I'm going to lay down water again in an ear shape, but not too much this time, so we can let it dry a little bit faster. Coming in with some neutral tint. You can see it's not quite spreading quite as much because there's just not as much water here. Let's just do a different color for fun. We'll just do some cobalt. And we're gonna let this dry before we add in extra water. Not completely, we're gonna let it dry almost all the way and then come back and add in some water onto that ear. This ear is definitely getting on the dry side. It's just barely wet. So let's drop in some water and see what happens. You can see that it's pushing that cobalt pigment and the neutral tint pigment around. So it's just interesting to see the different effects that can happen depending on the wetness of your paper. And I'm gonna go in and just encourage that pigment to move around with my brush by scrubbing it with my brush. And then dropping in a little bit more water so the pigment can move. It's just cool to see how these different ears are drying. And what can happen when you add in water. We're basically intentionally creating blooms, the cowl flowers that everybody talks about, because that can look so good and so interesting in your art. So I have Daniel Smith Hematite Genuine, which is a highly granulating black color. Watery techniques in general can really bring out some beautiful aspects of granulation. So I'm just gonna lay down some water to create a wash of Hematite Genuine. And I'm gonna make it so it's heavy at the top and then it kind of runs down the page. So I'm just dipping my flat brush into paint straight from the tube, so it's a very heavy mix of Hematite Genuine. And I'm gonna put it at the top here. Now you can see, even though there's a lot of pigment, it's not that dark of a color. It's just kind of interesting. So it's still wet down here, but I'm putting most of the pigment at the top. And I want to lay down a nice amount of pigment here. Sometimes you need to get your brush a little wet so that the pigment flows out of the brush and onto the paper. Okay, that's looking dark, like we've put a lot on there. I'm gonna clean my brush so that I only have water on it. I'm gonna tip my paper. It's still wet down here. And I'm going to just put water, clean water at the top, so it will run down into the wash. And I just kind of want to see what it does. Now you could also use a spray bottle with this technique and spray water at the top or spray water on it and see what happens. But it's really producing some interesting granulation. Look at how much that separates. That's quite amazing. So I could see myself using this in my portraiture work for maybe some really interesting backgrounds or some really abstract animal fur. So not many colors will do it like this as much as Hematite Genuine will. Okay, let's create another wash down here at the bottom of the page. I'm gonna have fun and do a purple wash. So I have my opera pink. and my ultramarine blue. So this is very wet, and for water resist to work, we're gonna need it to be almost dry. So let's wait for it to get to that almost dry stage. Okay, I'm hoping you can see that this is still shiny, but it's really starting to lose its shine. And that's kind of what we're looking for, is that barely shiny stage. So we're gonna go for color resist, which is adding color to a wash like this, so a barely wet area, nice heavy mix of color, and we're gonna do water resist. So we're just adding plain water, and both of these things will push pigment away. You're pushing it with color or you're pushing it with water. Heavy mix of this quinacridone, and I know that quinacridone particularly does a good job at resisting, at pushing other colors away. Every color will behave a little bit differently, so it's something you can play around with. Now we have water. And you can see how it's pushing the pigment away. You can be controlled or you can do splattery marks with the water, splattery marks with the paint to push that color away. And that's it. It's just that simple. But the key is getting the wash the right dryness level. Again, if it's too wet, everything will just blend together. And if it's too dry, you're just going to be painting a new layer of paint over that paint. It takes practice, but don't give up, because as you can see, it produces some really beautiful effects. Another color that works particularly well for color resist is cobalt teal. And I have a nice heavy mix of cobalt teal on my brush. And there are some areas of this wash that are still at a good wetness level where the color will push the pigment away. So I just want to show you what that might look like. Now this area is looking really dry, so you can see the difference of putting that paint on a dry area. It's not going anywhere. It's just adding a new layer of paint. But when we're putting it on an area that's wet, that perfect wetness level, it's pushing the pigment and creating some beautiful watercolory effects. The key is just getting the level of dryness correct on your bottom wash, and using a heavy mix of color with the color you're adding to the top. I could see how you could possibly use this for snowflakes, multicolored fur, abstract elements of interest, and backgrounds. It's almost a way of negative painting. Obviously, you can get lighter areas to produce some detail. There's a lot of fun ways you can utilize this in the art that you make. Let's put the techniques that we just learned about to work in our funky fish painting. Remember, you can get the reference photo and the tracing for your funky fish in the video description. All right, let's continue our work on this funky fish. And you can see I had a little mishap when I was going around my painting. So I'm just gonna take a clean Kleenex and try to blot that out. And if you catch it right away, it should be pretty easy. So that looks good. I'm not gonna worry about it. I'm not gonna fuss with it or try to blot it out further, because sometimes you can end up making more of a mess. The first technique we're gonna use as we continue to paint the funky fish is dropping in water. And we're gonna do that around his eye orbital areas. So we're gonna start by painting with water, first step in the process. And I'm gonna just dye it a little bit and make it slightly gray so you can kind of see where I'm putting it. The other thing I want you to know is I want you to leave a white space between this orbital area and his pupil. And I think that's going to be really important in creating a nice contrast and making sure our eye goes to his eyes when we look at this finished painting. Okay, so you can see where I painted with water. We have a nice perimeter of water all up to the edge of the outer eye and leaving that white space around his pupil. Now I'm going to go ahead and lift a little bit of this water out because there's just a lot. So I dab my brush, lift a little bit. Otherwise it's just going to take quite a while for it to dry. Okay, now we're just adding a little bit of neutral tint, a watery mix of neutral tint, which still looks pretty dark as you can see, to the area we painted with water. So dabbing it in, dabbing my brush, and then I'm facilitating it to mix a little bit here. And we're not going to be afraid that it's too dark because with dropping in water, our intent is to push the pigment to the edges of the area we just painted. So we kind of want to have enough pigment to push around. So this is a pretty watery mix, but it's still pretty intense. So we're just helping it mix into the water we already painted. And that looks really good. So now we're gonna wait until, again, we have that almost dry stage. And then we'll drop in our water to push the pigment to the outside edges. So the paper is getting less and less shiny. I have a blotted brush here and I'm kind of lifting, and we haven't gone over this technique yet, but I am lifting a little bit of that pigment out. Just by having a pretty dry brush, it'll pick some of that pigment up around the center, and that'll just give our water that we lay down a little bit more space to work its magic. And it'll facilitate it to dry a little bit faster. All right, let's go ahead and just lay water down. So I have plain water here. Tap it a little bit. We don't want to flood it, but we do want to have a nice amount of water on our brush. And we're just going to lay it down right in the center around those areas we painted. And you can see how it's moving towards the edges. It's moving that pigment towards the edges. So drop it in, bring it down. Try not to touch the edges at this point because we want the pigment to move to those edges. So I'm just dropping it down right in the middle. And sometimes you can go in and lift the pigment in the center out as you go. This technique does work well in conjunction with lifting. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more water because I really want that pigment pushed to the edges of where we painted. And sometimes it helps even to scrub the pigment right under where you're putting the water to help it lift off the paper and settle near the edges instead of where it was settling in before. We're going to practice more water and color resist techniques as we continue to paint this fish. I have a round brush loaded with plain water, so I'm going to paint with water first, the technique we learned yesterday, and I'm not going to be afraid to go into those areas we already painted. So I'm going to lift up a little bit of this color so you can see where my water is going. And basically we're going to be creating the shadow area in the belly. So I'm going to go all the way into that orange we painted yesterday. I'm going to do a kind of purple. because if we do straight blue, because it is kind of a bluish shadow, it will turn pretty green. So I kind of want to do a purple color. So I'm going to put in some opera pink and let that mix around. And then I'm going to put in just a little bit of ultramarine blue. And let that mix. Coming in with some more water, just to make it more of a watery shadow and to bring that color into the orange area just a little bit. I'm going to kind of scrub just a little bit along the edges so that they create more of a blurry line, a blurry edge here. I'm going to drop in a little bit of water and push it. We're going to do a similar thing to try to make that pigment flow towards the edges of where we're painting and create a little bit of a highlight in the center. So I'm also lifting some water out in this highlighted area. Dabbing a little bit more of the pink and blue near the edges. Now there are faster, kind of simplified ways if I was just painting this whole fish in one go that I would use. But the whole point of this painting is for you to practice these techniques. So this is a more roundabout way of painting a fish, but that's okay because that's the point. It's still pretty wet, but I'm gonna actually drop in a little more water because I just love how it pushes the paint. So I'm gonna drop in the water and push it towards the edges in this belly area. And this is one of the most beautiful aspects of watercolor, is this translucency, this light aspect. And look at how cool that looks. Just looks so cool. I'm kind of tilting my head down at an angle so I can see how shiny it is. It will be hard for you to see how shiny it is, but this area right here is getting less and less shiny, where I think color resist will work. So I'm gonna come in and see, let's just see if Azo Yellow will work for color resist here. So a really heavy, heavy, heavy mix of this beautiful bright yellow. So I'm trying to have enough on my brush that my brush will actually let go of it, and a nice heavy mix. I think I would need a little bit more in my brush. And we're just gonna maybe see if it will let us have some dots. And remember, often less is more, so we're just gonna try to contain ourselves, restrain and contain. That worked beautifully. I think that looks really nice. And it's pushing away that top level color because we have a base level layer that we did in the last video, and it likely won't be pushing that layer away, but it will be pushing that top layer away. And it's just a way to have some subtle detail. So now I'm gonna wait for this area to get that matte stage a lot less shiny, and we'll do some water resist. Okay, I have plain water on my round brush, not a ton. I'm dabbing it on the edge here, but I still have some, enough that I think will release into the painting without releasing too much. And I'm just gonna focus on the areas where I think this will work the best, where it's a little drier. And then I'm kind of scrubbing the pigment off as well. So again, using this in tandem with lifting. A little bit of spray here. And you can see that was working here to push a little bit of pigment away. Looks really beautiful. Before we head out, I also just want to soften these areas where these paint colors meet. So I have a wet brush and I'm just kind of scrubbing along this painted edge to see if I can make it look a little bit less harsh. And up here too. Our painting area is just like seconds away from being dry. I have a heavy mix of quinacridone. And I'm gonna see if it'll allow me to, if it'll resist in any of these areas that are still a teensy bit wet. This is all too dry, but there are some barely wet areas up here. So I'm just dropping it in. It looks like it's working. It's pushing the pigment and water. This one didn't work as well. It was just too dry. So I'm gonna lift that out to create a bit of a highlight for fun. Lifting is just also a very magical tool in watercolor. I'm adding a little bit of water. I kind of like what's happening here with this pushing of pigment. So I'm gonna let it push the pigment to the edges, just like we did in the eyes. Dropping in a little bit more quinacridone there. Perfect. We'll let that dry and we will continue working on our funky fish in tomorrow's video. 2 more fun techniques are waiting for you in tomorrow's video where we're gonna learn about glazing and negative painting. I will see you then.